It's kind of weird to think about how a lot of the arguments that I got into with No Thank You leading up to the end of us being friends sort of revolved around topics that he actively admitted that he didn't care about. He regularly said, I'm not going to research this thing, I don't care about it. Those explicit terms. Or one of the things he would say was, is that it sucks to read things that you don't agree with, which I thought was particularly weird because how else are you going to learn things? You can't just agree with something inherently, and then only read things that confirm that belief, or else you just become an ideologue, You're not learning anything at that point, you're just believing what you already believe and then refusing to go outside of your lane. But him as a postmodernist, someone who actively goes against socially constructed norms and beliefs that are to be true, or overarching narratives, as Derrida had talked about. It's interesting to me that, he believed in these conventional ideas of wisdom and of, I am correct with age, is that he had believed that he was inherently more correct than I was because he was older, which in and of itself is a socially constructed idea. That's age itself is a social construct in postmodernist terms. And yet he advocates for it. He advocates for this idea that very clearly goes against postmodernism. And in the pursuit of that, he uses this postmodernism, this lack of truth, as an excuse in order to say, well, I don't need to research anything I say because truth doesn't exist anyway. And so even though I've actively said I have no interest in researching these things, I don't care, I'm right about it anyway because I'm older, or I'm right about it anyway because I just inherently am. And it's like that contradictory idea of advocating for socially constructed ideas like wisdom and so on, that this wise man is just going to come up off of a hill after 50 or so years and then say, oh, this is the correct path to truth and stuff, is an appeal to authority. But it's typical anarchist talk. It's only against the rules when you do it, but when I do it, it's fine. Like when I would say, well, this very, very old person has done all of this research and has a PhD and agrees with what I say, oh, that's an appeal to authority. But saying that, all of the major media outlets, major narratives disagree with it, so it must be true, that's not an appeal to authority. And then also saying that truth doesn't exist, and that socially constructed attitudes aren't real and shouldn't be advocated for, that doesn't contradict my narrative at all. This lenience, this ability to completely contradict oneself and not have any standards whatsoever characterized most of our arguments, is that I was very consistent in what I believed and what I advocated for in my logic, and he just continually bent the rules because he didn't care. He didn't care about what his beliefs meant or standing for something. He just got emotional, and his emotions were more important than making any points or arguing about anything. So it was very annoying. And I mean, this is the kind of behavior that I would put up with just about anyone. But the degree to which he did it, the fact that, he would insult me so often, he would present these things like they were just the paragons of truth. Like, he was so fundamentally correct, even though his arguments were laden with argumentative fallacies, with, you know, contradictions. Um, he said, it's so true and you're just so wrong, when I was able to provide evidence for the things I was saying and argue for them, and with consistency, something that he clearly didn't have the ability to do. Um, the fact that, like, I was able to do that, his only defense was, well, you're young, and that's the reason why you're wrong, which is not only contradicting his own ideology, it's also an ad hominem fallacy. So it was pretty annoying, arguing with him for the longest time. And eventually, I just said, screw it, um, not gonna engage with this guy anymore, because, like, he would just continue over and over and over again, to use that same kind of logic to insult me, um, and I think people should have enough self-respect to not put up with being insulted that frequently, if you're just letting someone walk all over you, I think it's it's both a sign of weakness, and it's also just generally not something I would say people should do. It's not friendship, if you've let someone into your life and called them a friend, given them trust, I don't think you should allow them to just constantly be rude to you and argue in bad faith, say that, like, well, my side is just right, and I'm going to argue on the behalf that they're good, that there's always going to be good intent. You can't argue that, one side is always going to have good intent. You have to go from a neutral position until you can assess enough evidence. Enough evidence comes into force. It was really, I think maybe the Hong Kong riots were some kind of trigger for him, because he saw it as, the existence of the police is police brutality, and it's, even though the police didn't kill anybody, it was, he tried to construct this narrative that, like, I somehow supported the police. I don't support the police in Hong Kong. I never claimed to support the police in Hong Kong, not once. But he kept on saying that I did. I just didn't support the protesters. You can not support the police and also not support the protesters at the same time. But he continued over and over again trying to strawman me, saying that I somehow did, and I don't. It's very, very strange. It's very, very strange. Now, I don't think people should have to resort to mental gymnastics and argumentative fallacies if they have a good point. They shouldn't have to resort to personal attacks if they have a good point. They should just make their point. It's a sign of weakness if someone is just constantly insulting you without actually being able to substantiate anything that they say. For someone who claims to not care about any of the stuff he's saying, he seems to care an awful lot, at least enough to be able to insult me without providing any evidence, and to contradict his worldview constantly in the pursuit of doing so. So that was why I stopped talking to No Thank You. I think he's generally a very boring person. I don't see very much interest in talking to him, just because he doesn't do anything. He just makes music, and I think music is generally pretty boring. So it's one of those things where, you know, he just exists. It's not even like there's a positive or negative about him. He's just there. He's made a lot of good videos, but it's one of those things where, like, him as a person, it's not good or bad. He's just nothing, you know? I don't mean that as an insult. It's just like he contradicts his worldview so much, and he's just so incoherent that he's not an interesting person to talk to. Just not an interesting person in general. Like, it feels like everything he does, he's trying to make an aesthetic. You know, he's trying to be a aesthetic person with music and everything. Like, his entire worldview is filtered through aesthetics. That's the way he sees the world, is through, you know, feelings and beauty and visualization, sound, understanding things through abstractions rather than concrete explanations, which is fine, but it doesn't feel like he's making anything significant out of that, you know? Like, he's kind of said all of the interesting things already, and now he's just there. You know, like, there's not anything positive or negative about him. He's just a boring blob flying throughout space, you know? And it's a little bit sad because his whole deal is that he wants to express, you know, he wants to be this expression of stuff, and like, look at me, I'm so expressive, and I can rebel and stuff, you know? The kind of spirit of rebellion just there. And doesn't really feel like he's doing that. It just feels like he exists, you know? Like a perfectly mediocre 5 out of 10. And he's generally just pretty boring. I don't see a reason to speak to him. They're like, what motivation do you have to speak to a boring person who's just going to constantly insult you? Basically none. But ultimately I was very glad that I made the decision not to talk to him. But I had made the decision at like 3 a.m. and I was really, really tired. And usually I say pretty strange things when I haven't had sleep for a long time. And so, it sounded pretty weird. Just because I was so fed up because I had my trust betrayed and all that. And trust is something I take pretty seriously because I don't allow very many people into my life, you know. I don't commit to very many people. But when I do, it's something that I do try to take seriously. And when other people are not trying to be a friend, you know, when other people don't appreciate that friendship, it feels like you're being stabbed in the back, you know? Like being a friend to them just didn't matter, you know? And so I didn't want to put up with him being an asshole anymore. You have to have more self-respect than that, you know? Because no matter how polite I was and no matter how much of a good friend I was, he's just different. You know, he sees things from a moment-to-moment basis, temporary pleasure and this kind of thing. You're so focused on temporary pleasure, you begin to lose these kinds of ethics, understanding of relationship and stuff. I'm pretty tired again, actually, so I'm gonna go to sleep.